I think I'm the only Sunday school class teacher that starts on time at 9:15. I really do. I don't know. You guys have probably been as mothers and let people talk and all, but I need more time on the back end than on the front end. So I'd rather start on time, finish a little early because I got to gather my thoughts for moving from one thing into the other, going from Ruth into Romans 11. However, I will say these two things are really connected because Romans 11 today is Paul is talking about who is Israel. Who is Israel? And he really, throughout Romans 11, he's making the case that there's just one people of God. And not all Jews are the people of God. And there are a lot of Gentiles who are the people of God. And he talks about the true Israel. And there's no greater illustration of that truth than the book of Ruth, because Ruth is a Moabite. And I'm sure that Ben explained to you last week where they come from. So these are a cursed people, and God had commanded the Israelites to destroy them and not to have anything to do with them. So what do we do with this? I mean, here's the story of Ruth, a Moabite woman who is by birth an enemy of God and God's people, and yet we know the way this story ends. She's part of she's not just a part of Israel. She's a part of the line of Christ. And this is where we just see God highlighting his grace. Anytime you find anything in the Bible that sort of looks like a contradiction, you know, that's not right. God said the Moabites are cursed and to destroy them. But yet here, Ruth is a Moabite being in the line of Christ. Don't run away from it. Don't be scared of it. Run toward it. It's not an accident, and it's not an inconvenience. It's not something to be explained away. There's always some great truth there. And that's the case here. Ruth, a Moabite, included in Israel, included in the line of Christ. What greater illustration could you have of the grace of God? That God takes people that are his enemies and he shows them grace. And the very fact that he highlighted the Moabites for destruction, and yet even in this, he saves Ruth. It's just a great evidence that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And the reality is, there's not two different hells. There's not one hell for like Moabites, Canaanites, and another hell for unsaved Jews. The reality is anybody that does not come to God through faith in Jesus Christ is lost. And so you see this theme throughout the scripture, that there are people who look like they should be favored of God, but they're lost. Esau comes to mind. Esau, a son of Isaac. I mean, you know, he's pretty close to the Abraham. Yeah, Abraham, Isaac, Esau. And yet Esau is, God says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And so here's Esau, one who we would expect to be favored of God, and yet he's hated of God. And here's Ruth, we would expect to be hated of God, and yet she's favored of God. And what's the difference? Well, it's faith. It's just that simple. It gets down to whether or not a person ever had faith, and no one's saved simply because they're born a Jew. Everyone is born in sin. Everyone. Jews, Gentiles, everybody. And salvation requires an act of God and an act of faith, the faith of the individual, and even, I would argue, the faith of Christ. That we're ultimately saved through his faith. So Ruth is a great illustration of that and the way God includes her in Israel. And that's certainly comforting to me because I'm not a Jew. I'm not a physical descendant of Abraham. Yet Paul makes the case in Romans and Galatians and elsewhere, but especially in those two books, that the true Israel are those who believe with believing Abraham. And here you see that Ruth's well, her in-laws, her father-in-law, her husband, their faith is nowhere seen here. We don't know for certain their spiritual condition, but we do know this. They didn't trust God to provide for them. They didn't stay in the land like he told them to. They leave the land, and of all places, they go to Moab. They leave Bethlehem, the house of bread, and go to Moab, the cursed land, completely out of the will of God. And yet we see Moab, the Moabite, who leaves the cursed land, and she comes to Bethlehem, the house of bread. Which of these have faith? Well, it's clearly her. That's what we want to see about. So at the end of, I think Ben went down to verse 18 last week. Is that right? And I think Ruth's profession of faith to me is the greatest profession of faith in the Old Testament. Now, I argue that salvation there's only one way of salvation. There's not an Old Testament way and a New Testament way. Don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that in the Old Testament they're saved by offering sacrifices. A lot of lost people offered sacrifices. And you find throughout Scripture in both Testaments the argument that no one can be saved by the blood of bulls and goats. In Psalm 50, if you were in my Wednesday night class where I talked about the number 1,000, where God says, he says there, he's mocking the Israelites. He says, you think I need lambs for sacrifice? You think I need bulls and goats? Hell, I own the beast of the forest are mine and the cattle on 1,000 hills. And there's God, even in the Old Testament, telling them, your sacrifices don't save you. I don't need your sacrifices. That's not the point of offering sacrifices. They were always to point to the one sacrifice that would be made. And so understand that whether someone lived in the time of the Old Testament or the New, they're looking to the same Savior and they're looking at the same event for salvation. In the Old Testament, they're looking forward to the coming of the Messiah who will take away their sin. And they have to believe that. They have to have faith in that. And you see lots of examples of Old Testament believers, Old Testament Israelites who are not believers. They don't trust in God. They might go through the ritual and the routine of offering sacrifices, but their heart is far from God. Jesus dealt with a whole bunch of them every day of his life, right? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the chief priests. Very few of them are stepping forward and believing in Jesus, and this is why he has an encounter with them. Well, I'm going to look at one of those passages today in the sermon. So don't ever think that anybody's saved simply because they're born a Jew or because they even go through the ritual and the routine of offering sacrifices. Faith was always the means by which God saved anybody. And Ruth is a precise example of that. Ruth makes this incredible profession of her faith. She does not merely say to her mother-in-law, Naomi, hey, I'm going to stick with you. I love you. I like you. I really don't like my family back home, so I'm just going to be with you. Notice she goes far beyond that. She says, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and here it is, your God, my God. And she chooses to follow the God of the Hebrews. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. Now look what she says. May the Lord. Oh, you see that word? You see it in your Bible, it's in all caps. So what does that mean? What's the name of the Lord she uses there? Yahweh. Yeah, Yahweh. It may Yahweh. Okay. No, the word Elohim, the sort of the everyday word for God in the Old Testament, is used by other people of their gods. Baal and Astarte and all these false gods are called Elohim. But no God but the God of the Hebrews is ever called Yahweh. That's the personal name for the God of the Hebrews. And when Ruth says, may Yahweh do so to me and more also if anything but death parts me from you. She's calling on the name of the Lord. And what does Paul say? Whosoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be what? Saved. So what you have here is not merely Ruth's expression of love for her mother-in-law, but her expression of love for the God of her mother-in-law. Now this happens all the time. We have a couple here in our church. They've given me permission to share their story whenever it's helpful, and I don't ever share it in their presence because it's just a painful memory. But we have a couple in our church that, let me sort of tell this whole story because some of you know it, some of you don't. New people here at Buck Run don't know this story, but some of you were here and lived through it. Because one of the key themes of Ruth is the providence of God. And I just want you to see the way the providence of God works to use even horrible circumstances like famines to bring about the salvation of his people. And it was years ago when the McDonald's, East Side McDonald's burned down right before Christmas. Some of you remember that? East Side McDonald's burned down, and we were putting together money for our Lottie Christmas offering. And, it was the Sunday before the last Sunday before Christmas. And so you know what we do the last Sunday before Christmas? We have communion, and we have our walk to the manger. And so the Sunday before that, Tim Hughes walks into my office between the services. We had 2 services then. And Tim says, Pastor, did you see the East Side McDonald's burned down? I said, yeah, I saw that. Oh, that's terrible. And he said, most of those workers there, they're working on minimum wage. Most of them are Hispanic. And he says, right before Christmas, now they're out of a job. They don't have any money. Maybe I think we should do something for them. I'm like, now people come to me all the time, and everybody has a different burden and sees good things to do. But immediately I'm thinking, well, that is a good thing to do, but, it's a Lottie Christmas offering, and we're already taking up an offering next Sunday. And I started explaining this to Tim, and I say, I'd like to figure out a way to help those people, but I don't think we can get it in before Christmas, maybe right after. But, next Sunday's the Lottie Christmas offering. And I don't want people cutting into their Lottie Christmas offering to give to this, so I think it's probably better to do 2 different offerings. And Tim looked at me and he said, Pastor, if you ask people to not cut into their Lottie Christmas offering, but instead cut into their own Christmas in order to give to those folks who work at McDonald's, they'll do it because you ask, but you have to ask. And I just tell people, it's so inconvenient when your deacons are far more spiritual than you are. It's just not a pleasant feeling at all. And that happens regularly here at Buck Run. And I'm like, okay, let me talk to the staff and we'll figure out, what we're going to do. And so, I thought we got to do something. And we didn't have email and everything the way we do now. Back then we had a technology called One Call. Some of you remember us doing the One Call system, and I could make a phone call and would dial everybody's phone and deliver a message. And so I did this One Call message saying, look, Sunday we're going to take up the Lottie Christmas offering, but we're going to take up a second offering, and it's going to be to help these workers at McDonald's. And then Sunday night, instead of Sunday evening services, which we had then, we're going to do a banquet for them. And for their families, and we're going to love on them. And with whatever we take up Sunday morning for them, we're going to give them gift cards And so I need you to come Sunday. I need you to give real generously. Don't cut into your Lottie Christmas offering. Sacrifice your own Christmas in order to help these people. And we're going to love on them Sunday night. And so we did it. And that Sunday, I think we still had our Lottie Christmas offering was still over $80,000, which was big back then. And we took up $10,000 for the McDonald's workers. And so that night, they all came, and this is in our old building over there in the fellowship hall. We had a big meal for them, put on a big spread, and served them, and just loved them. Man, they were so happy. I mean, they just couldn't believe that people who didn't even know them would love on them like this. And I remember one guy, he had the F word tattooed on his neck. He came up to me, he said, "Hey, preacher," he said, "I probably will never go to church, but if I do, it'll be this one." And I'm like, I'm okay with that. That's really what we're going for, that if ever he wakes up in the pig pen like the prodigal, this is where he thinks about coming. And so we loved it. And then they thought all they were getting was the dinner. And when we were through with the dinner, we gave them, everybody got $150 worth of gift cards from Walmart and Kroger so they could get stuff for the Christmas dinner and all that. They were blown away. They just couldn't believe that people who didn't even know them would do this for them. As a side note, I will tell you that when they opened the new McDonald's, that nice big flashy sign they've got out front, for 1 week, that sign said, "Thank you, Buck Run." For the first week that McDonald's was open, they were publicly thanking us. But so anyway, that was on that dinner was the last Sunday before Christmas. It was something like the 22nd or 23rd of December that year. Fast forward, the day after New Year's, there was no State Journal on New Year's Day, but on January 2nd, front page of the State Journal, there was an article in there about a Honduran couple coming out of their apartment at 5 o'clock in the morning, and that the man was taking the woman to the West Side McDonald's. And it said she worked at the East Side, but because of it being burned down, she was getting to work she worked at the East Side, but she was getting to work at the West Side, and that he was taking her. And they were in the parking lot of their apartment building. They were accosted by 3 men who shot him in the stomach, and then they took her out of the country and they raped her. And it was about as horrible a circumstance as you could imagine. But Debbie Wicker, a member of our church, saw that in the paper, and she said, "Oh, I know." It didn't give their names because of the nature of the crime, but she said, "I know this couple." She knew who they were. They were at our banquet. I ate with them, and she had met them before. And Debbie just gets in her car and goes to the UK hospital. They had found Selwyn in the parking lot, and life flighted him to UK, and Mata had to go to some farmhouse or something out there. It was just a horrible thing. And eventually they get reunited at the UK hospital. And, a couple of days later, Debbie Wicker shows up, and she doesn't speak any Spanish, and Mata didn't speak any English, and Selwyn was out. His stomach was outside of his body. They had, in the surgery, there's a way that while they're doing between surgeries, that they leave things outside of the body, and that was the case. And Debbie just somehow communicates to Mata that, "I'm here to take over your life. You don't need to worry about a thing." And Debbie, I remember the very next Sunday, brought Mata to Buck Run, and like 40 of our ladies surrounded her down front. So you remember that? And just surrounded her and prayed for her. And she could not understand a word, with the possible exception of the word Jesus. And everybody, they just loved on her and prayed for her. And Buck Run walked through all that time with them, and it was a long healing process physically and mentally, emotionally. But man, they were just loved on. Now let me ask you, how do you think they begin to think about the Jesus that Buck Run people love? What do you think happens? Well, they want to follow that Jesus. I mean, nobody put any conditions on loving them and serving them, but I'll never forget the day Selwyn came to me and he said, Pastor, we need to talk to you. We want to be disciples of Jesus. And that's, come on. And we went in my office and we talked, and I would explain the gospel to him in English, and he would then translate it to Mata in Spanish, and I made it as clear as I could. They came from a Honduran Catholic background. I needed to make sure they understood what we don't believe and what we do and distinguish it from what I knew they'd been taught. And man, they were in. They wanted to trust Christ, and they did. Now I want you to see that they fell in love with people, but then they wanted to know what made those people how they were, and they wanted to serve the God those people worshiped. And Selwyn and Mott have been, I assume they will be in the service today. They've been here in our church for well over 10 years now. Other people have come to faith in Christ because of their witness. I'll tell you, one of the most incredible things I've ever seen was standing in the courtroom. They caught the guys, and I'll never forget being in the courtroom the day that Selwyn got to stand there at the sentencing hearing and make his victim impact statement. And he went into great detail of what this had done to their lives, and even just the fear they feel when they walk out to their car, and how it impacted them, and just the horrible stuff they'd been through, and the surgeries, and her physical and emotional trauma, and horrible things. And as he said it all in great detail, then he looked right at the defendant, and he said, "But Jesus has forgiven me all my sin, and I forgive you." And I watched big old 350-pound sheriff's deputies standing there just absolutely sobbing and shaking. The judge who saw me in the courtroom with them called me later that day, and he said, "I think that was the greatest thing I've ever seen in a courtroom in all of my career." I just want you to see that God often uses relationships to get people to Christ. It's the number one thing. And so when you see this in the book of Ruth, where Ruth chooses Naomi, instead of going back to her home and her parents, instead of waiting for a husband from among her people, that statement that she makes, "Your God will be my God," that is a declaration of faith. And then when she says, "May the Lord," then she invokes his name. Now this tells me something, that the time they have been down there in Moab, Naomi has been talking to her about her God. So yeah, I mean, they're out of the place of God, out of the will of God, but Naomi has at least communicated to Ruth who God is, because Ruth here invokes him. "May Yahweh do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." Man, she's not just saying, "Oh, I love you, Naomi." She's saying, "I love your God. Your God sent you to me." And God often does that. This is the way the Lord often works, through relationships. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Okay? So verse 19, the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. I tell you, I love that word in the Bible, until. It's always an interesting word. In Luke 15, how long does the shepherd search for the lost sheep? He searches until he found it. And how long does the woman search for the lost coin? Until she finds it. And these two go on until they came to Bethlehem. And again, these are real places and real names, but the symbolism shouldn't be lost on us. They left because they're starving. But, you leave, you go out there into the world because you think you've got these problems that somehow aren't getting solved while you're in the place God put you. So you get out of his will and you go where you want to go. But you realize, man, that just didn't solve anything. It's like Peter, James, and John going back to fishing in John 21. God's not going to leave them there. Naomi left Bethlehem. God's not going to leave her there. So they went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. Hey, Naomi's been gone a long time. Naomi's back. Bethlehem is a little town. At this point, even Jerusalem is less than 12 acres big. And Bethlehem's smaller than that. So it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody. The landowners own fields outside of the town. They live in the town and they go out in the fields and harvest. But because enemies can come, you bunch up and stay together so you can fight against the enemies if you're attacked. And so when she comes into the town of Bethlehem, there in the hills of Judea, she causes a stir. And they're saying, oh, it's Naomi. Now the name Naomi means sweet. Have you ever known any Naomis? Did they live up to their name? There's the question. If your name is Naomi, you ought to live up to it for sure. And Naomi says, I'm not living up to my name. The women said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, I think Naomi's a bit of a drama queen, but I like her. She says, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. If you remember back in the book of Exodus, when the Israelites get to a place where the waters are bitter, they call it Mara, bitter waters. And it's like salt water. They can't drink it. And so she says, don't call me sweet. Call me bitter, because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. It's interesting. She does not call God by his name. I think that would be a little too almost blasphemous. She doesn't call him Yahweh here. The Almighty. It's interesting. Ruth uses the Lord's name, and Naomi uses an adjective, a nominalized adjective. The Almighty has brought calamity upon me. He's dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord brought me back empty. Okay. Did she go away full? Well, she had her sons and she had her husband, but they're leaving because they don't have bread. And I do think sometimes we have a way of misremembering the past. It's always the good old days, when the good old days weren't so good. Just because of the difficulties we face now, sometimes we look a little too nostalgically on the past. And I think here she's recreating the story. They weren't entirely full when they left. But she said, why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So now finally the name of the Lord comes in. Yahweh has testified against me. Well, that's not quite as blasphemous as saying that he dealt bitterly, but his word is against me. She's like, oh, God it's like she's saying he's put a curse on me. God's just not letting anything good happen in my life. This is basically the case that she's making. And so, she wants everybody to know how hard her life has been. And by the way, it has been hard. It's been tough. But God has been faithful. He's given her this lovely daughter-in-law who's like a daughter to her, who cares for her deeply, who loves her, and has really it's interesting. Ruth has converted to the God Naomi is bitter against. What an act of grace that God uses Naomi anyway, in spite of her bitterness. It's hard, I think, for a bitter Christian to lead anybody to the Lord. What a testimony of God's grace that in spite of Naomi's bitterness, Ruth believes in the God that she worships. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now notice the artful way that the author, by the way, we don't know who the author is. We don't know who wrote this story. But the artful way that he puts right in there the time of year it is, and by telling us it's at the time of the barley harvest, he's not just locating it temporally, but here's a little tip to what's coming. Because the barley harvest is going to figure greatly into the story. The fact that it's the time of the harvest. So here's the picture. They're coming back from Moab where they've been dealt with bitterly. Naomi's lost her husband and her 2 sons, 1 daughter-in-law. They left because of famine, but when they come back, what did they learn? Man, if you just had stayed put, things did turn around. They got better. God gave the harvest. And so the author here, with just an economy of words, tells us so much. Well, the Lord has long ago probably given them food again. And they're doing very well. But Naomi didn't get in on it, so she left and she went away. But now they're back, and it's the time of the barley harvest. Now, moving from one culture to another is challenging at any age. It's hard. Have any of you ever moved from like one culture to another? There are things you just don't know. Sometimes there are little things in one culture you don't get. I've told many times a story about me moving from Western Kentucky to Detroit when I was 15. That was really, really hard. Moving down to Brazil when I was 19 to live down there for a little while. Every time I've changed cultures, there's stuff I've learned. Like I just wasn't clued into it all. Years ago, they translated my preaching book into Korean, and it was the #1 best-selling Christian book in Korea. I outsold Rick Warren and Joel Osteen for a while. And so Tanya and I were invited to go to Korea, and one day they got a suite for me in a hotel and just had a string of Christian magazine editors and people come in and interview me all day long, one after another. And I'll never forget these 2 guys come in from the biggest Christian magazine in Korea, and they're asking me about preaching, and I'm answering stuff, and they said, well, what do you think are the greatest dangers a preacher faces? And I've got a pretty standard answer to that. I talk about, eisegesis, and I talk about the desires of the flesh. It's easy to be filled with pride and lust and things like that. And then I said, and laziness. And when I said that, I noticed they start looking at each other really uncomfortably. I said, and they said, well, what do you mean? I said, a pastor can be lazy and just not do anything and not give enough time to preparation or being with people or whatever. And they're looking totally uncomfortable at what I'm saying. And I don't know what I've done, but I know I've crossed some kind of cultural thing. And my translator was a former student of mine who was then a professor at Chongshin Seminary, the biggest evangelical seminary in Korea. And I can see he's trying to smooth things over with them, and I'm not figuring out at all what's going on. And when they finally leave, I looked at him and I said, can you tell me what just happened? He said, Dr. York, in Korea, there are no lazy preachers. I said, what? He said, no. He said, if you're lazy, you don't want to be a preacher. He said, it's true. Every church over there has a 5 a.m. prayer meeting every day. every day. And they have services most nights. On the weekend, they have these weekend-long services. Churches have these things called prayer mountains, and they go out in the country beginning Friday afternoon, and they'll have services, prayer around the clock. This is why I will tell you, Koreans weren't that impressed with what was going on out at Asbury, because they do that all the time. I mean, it's just like, that's just what they do. And it makes sense to me now. They're like, yeah, you can't be lazy and be a Korean preacher because everybody would know it the first week. You just wouldn't last. And, there was just that cultural difference. It's hard changing cultures. Now, imagine that you are Ruth and you've come from a culture that idolizes sex and sexuality. They have fertility gods and all kinds of, the statuary is where you really know what a people worshipped. And the statuary of the Moabites is always heightened sexuality and large genitalia, that kind of thing that you find in a lot of pagan cultures. And she comes from that, and now here she's living with a bunch of people who the God they worship, his primary characteristic is he's holy. That's a radical change to go from Moab across the Jordan River and the Dead Sea to the land of Canaan and there to Bethlehem. And she arrives there during the barley harvest. And so no doubt she's trying to figure out the cultural norms. Well, Ruth chapter 2 is about providence and provision and personal responsibility, but it's largely about redemption. And the narrator gives us a clue right here in verse 1 that Naomi had a relative, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, I think the names in Ruth mean something more than usual. I think the author's using these names to tell us, to remind us of certain theological truths. And so the clan that she's a part of is the clan of Elimelech, which simply means God is my king, or my God is king. And, okay, Ruth's coming from a place where, God's not king. Now she's in the clan of God is my king, a worthy clan, and the name of this man, who is a close relative, is Boaz. Now, why is that little detail important? That he's a relative. I'm trying to look back up. So when Naomi says in verse 8, Naomi said to her two daughters, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." What's she saying to them? Remarry. Remarry. Now, what's the typical way that a widow remarries is that levirate marriage. That she's going to get a younger brother. But Naomi, both her sons are dead, and she's an older woman now. She's not going to have any more children, and that's why she tells them, go home. Remember, a woman without a husband in the ancient Near East is a completely disenfranchised woman. There's not economic opportunity for her. She doesn't get a vote. She doesn't get any say. There's no one to protect her. There's no one to provide for her. There's very little she can do to provide for herself. So singleness is just really not an option for a younger woman. Widows are typically taken care of by either their children or the community, but widows are poor. And it's a better thing to have a husband. And she says, go back. But the fact that Ruth would rather stay with Naomi without a husband, which potentially means staying in poverty, is an incredible decision on her part. So here, look how the author is making us, we're picking up on the little clues here, excuse me. The little clue is, okay, now, she gets there to Bethlehem, but there is a worthy man of Elimelech's clan, a near kinsman, a relative, whose name is Boaz. And we go, oh, a relative. Now, again, an original reader of this would immediately go, this is a potential mate. He can fulfill the role of what's called the kinsman redeemer. He can claim whatever property that Ruth's deceased husband owns. That means also assuming any debts that he has. But whatever else, he's got to take the wife, and if he has children with her, that they're considered the deceased children and not his. That's a lot to give up. And in fact, this is why you see, I'm trying to think, I don't think anywhere in the Old Testament there is an example of a levirate marriage that went well. It seems an odd custom to us for a reason, because nobody liked it. My brother starts dating a girl I don't like, but I'm going to do everything I can to convince him, don't marry her. And you couldn't help but sort of size up. I mean, your brother's going to marry some girl. You got to be thinking, could I be married to her? It's just a real possibility. And so there are places in the Bible where it comes into play, but I'm trying to think if there's never a place where they lived happily ever after where an actual brother married her. This is the closest thing in the book of Ruth. And so we get this detail, he's a near kinsman. That means he might be the redeemer. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let's go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him. Now this word ears of grain, when Americans hear this word ears, we think of corn. But the word corn actually just simply means kernel. It's from the same root word. So that's why the real word of the thing we call corn is maize. Because you'll see King James Version uses a corn of wheat. If a corn of wheat, a kernel of wheat falls into the ground, and it just means a seed. And the same thing with ear. We don't talk about ears of wheat. We might talk about, clusters or whatever, but if you see this word ear of barley or ear of wheat, it's just talking about the cluster on the end of the plant. And so she says, let's go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. Now, I want to point out a few things here. So there's an ancient law that's at work here. And when God gave the law in Exodus, Leviticus, he gave a lot of laws about the care of the poor. And remember, Israel is a theocracy. God is its ruler. And he told them, he said, you should always care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger or the pilgrim in the land, somebody sojourning through. And rules of hospitality in the ancient Near East are really important rules to this day for both Arab and Jews. And so God gave laws of hospitality. One of the things, to care for the widow and the orphan, the poor, the sojourner in the land, you were never to completely harvest your field. So if you have a field this big, and this would be a pretty common sized field, remember you've got sort of the central town of Bethlehem. Around it are fields, and you've got some fields for the sheep to graze. the rockier places you would let sheep and goats graze so they can get the vegetation between the rocks, because you can't really plow that and plant stuff. But if you got pretty good soil, and it's really, really, really rocky around Bethlehem, and so to have a field where you could actually grow barley would be only a rich guy would have that. And so Boaz is rich because he's got a field where he can actually harvest grain. But the rule was you could not cut the corners. So if you go put your workers out there and they're cutting the grain, they can't cut the corners. You can't go right up to the fence row. You leave a border of wheat or barley, and then the widow, the poor, the sojourner in the land are welcome. They can come and they can harvest that. Now, it's a great plan because it's not a handout in the sense of, here, we'll cut this and separate the wheat from the chaff and get all it nice pressed down and shaken, and then we'll give it to you, and all you have to do is take it. No, it's you got to get out there and work for it, but you are allowed to go out there in someone else's field and harvest what they planted. And so you got to work for it, but it's available to you. It's a really very brilliant plan, I think, because it gives people the dignity of work and accomplishment, and it also teaches, on the other end, generosity, which that's a really good society when you have people who've been trained to be generous on the one hand and industrious on the other, so that no matter how poor you are, there's a way for you to have food, but what you can't do is nothing. If you do that, you're a beggar, and really the only people that do that, the only beggars, are people who have really serious physical handicaps, blind, unable to walk, that kind of thing. And the other thing is that if you're cutting the grain, if you accidentally drop it on the ground, you are not allowed to pick it up. So again, it teaches real care, but so don't drop it because you're not allowed to pick it up. But if you drop it, then the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger in the land, they get to pick it up. So there are all these rules, and you can tell that Boaz is meticulous about this. Now, don't forget that the book of Ruth is written with the book of Judges in the background. This is happening at the time of the book of Judges. And there's nobody in the book of Judges like Boaz. I can't find anybody with the character of Boaz, that this guy, he's following the law. He's very meticulous. What's the theme of the book of Judges? Everyone does that which is right in his own eyes. But Boaz isn't doing what's right in his own eyes. He's doing what God has told him to do. So, man, he shines in a very dark time. And so Naomi says, let me go and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. Now notice, Naomi's not being a matchmaker yet. That's going to come. But right now she's just saying, hey, I'm kin to this guy. He won't kick me out of his field. He'll let me glean. Let's go and we'll glean in his fields. And so that's what they do. She said to her, go, my daughter. So basically she sends Ruth to do the job, and she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. So Ruth is a dutiful daughter-in-law. She does what her mother-in-law tells her. She goes to this particular field, and she gleans after the reapers. They would just sort of hang there when the reapers pass along. They get up close to the fence row or whatever, and they stop and they leave, a yard of grain or whatever. Then Ruth would cut it and make sheaves. Or if they get a bundle and they drop it, then she would get to pick it up. So you follow right along behind the reapers, because you get whatever they leave or whatever they drop. And that's what gleaning is. But now look at this word. I love this word in verse 3. She set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Okay. I cannot help but read that with a wink coming from the author. He's going, yeah, she happened. Get it? First of all, this whole story is about God's particular providence, his providential care, the way God works out his will. I mean, Ruth is in the line of Christ. God has said from before the foundation of the world that Christ would come. And Paul tells us, we've studied in Romans about how God foreknew his own. So the one thing we can say with absolute certainty is nothing just happens. Nothing. God knows the end from the beginning. God never says, I didn't see that coming. These are words that are never uttered in Trinitarian session when the three persons of God are in fellowship. No one says, oh, wow, that's a surprise. Everything happens with God's purpose in mind. And the fact is that she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. This tells you something. Our perspective on earth is very different from God's perspective in heaven. Stuff just happens all the time from our perspective. And yet, it doesn't. I just told you that incredible story about Tim coming in my office and saying, did you see that the Eastside McDonald's burned down? And, I just look back on that. If that conversation didn't happen that day, I just shudder to think about how different life would be for a lot of people. But it did happen. When I was 20 years old, I finished my sophomore year at Michigan State and was working with my dad in his church on the weekend. I was leading the music there and working with the youth. And Dad walked in my little office there at 12 Ryan Baptist Church, and he said, hey, Brother Range just fired the guy that was leading the music at Ashland Avenue, and he's looking for somebody that can do both music and youth. And he said, you could do that. And I went, Dad, I'm just 20 years old. There's no way he's going to let a 20-year-old who's still in college do that job. And Dad said, you could do it. You could do it. And he said, why don't you go call Brother Range and ask his permission to submit a resume? And if it's a non-starter, he'll tell you, okay, it cost you a phone call. But if he says, well, yeah, you've already caught his eye, they might give you consideration. Everybody else in my life, my mother, my sisters went, you're crazy. They're not going to let a 20-year-old do that. And I did what my dad said. I called Brother Range. Brother Range said, I wouldn't hurt anything. I sent in the resume. Next thing you know, I'm at Ashland Avenue. My first day there is my first date with Tanya, and 6 months later we're married. And everything else in my life happened because my dad walked in that room and said, you could do that. I think of there are times like that, conversations and events in your life that had it happened any other way, you would not be who you are. My sister, a couple weeks ago, cleaning out my mom's house, and there's stuff in there from forever. And she found my dad's correspondence, all the letters he wrote from the mission field, from Brazil, to his mission organization. Brother H.H. Overby, the man that was the secretary, Dave Parks now has that role with that missions organization. And reading it, and then when all that happened with my dad, his health, and having to come home, I recently read through those letters and the agonizing decision my dad had to make, and Brother Overby was trying to counsel him. Well, and Dad had to go to the Mayo Clinic. He said, you come back and you go to the clinic, but leave Doris and the kids there until you get a diagnosis. But my dad was convinced that it was going to be a bad diagnosis, and he brought us home, and he beat his letter of resignation to the States. And I'm reading all this in these letters. The thing that struck me is Brother Overby, I think he was a little upset with my dad for leaving the field and all that. He tried to help my dad find a church. And the church he tried to help my dad get was in Mount Morris, Michigan, which is right outside of Flint, in 1962. And I was reading these letters between Brother Overby and my dad in 1962. And they don't call my dad as pastor. And Brother Overby, I read his letter saying, I'm so sorry that didn't work out. And I'm reading the letter going, I'm so glad that didn't work out. I don't know who I would be had I grown up in Michigan instead of in Kentucky. I don't know who I'd be. And I could look at that and say, it just so happened that they didn't get interested in my dad. But you and I both know it didn't just so happen. It was ordered of the Lord. And man, am I grateful. I can remember when I came to Ashland Avenue in 1990 as pastor, right? So fast forward 10 years, I had gone to seminary and finished all my PhD work except my dissertation. Ashland Avenue called me back as pastor. And, I did 2 years just trying to get the church going and energized again. And the Lord was really blessing. But what that meant was for 2 years, I didn't even touch my dissertation, but the clock is ticking. It's got to be done by a certain time. And I walked in the house one day and I looked at Tanya and I said, I'm going to withdraw from the PhD program because I don't need anybody to call me doctor. And, I got the education I needed. The only thing I lack is the dissertation, but I don't have to do that. And, I gave all these spiritual reasons for it. It just feeds your pride and all this stuff. And so I'm going to withdraw from the PhD program. And Tanya looked at me and she said, no, you're not going to do that. And I said, what? Here's my sweet, loving wife with a meek and quiet spirit, like, she's Sarah's daughter. And I went, what? And she said, you're not going to do that. She said, you weren't the only one who went down there. You aren't the only one who sacrificed for this to happen. The boys and I left everything to go down there with you, and you're not going to drop the ball this close to the finish line. It hurt my feelings. I was like, well, I fully expected her to go, well, that's all right, darling. I'm proud of you anyway. And she didn't do that. She just said, no, you're not going to do that. And you're going to get that thing done. You need to do whatever you need to do to finish it, but you're too close to the end to drop the ball. Wow. Talk about pressure. There was no, and I did what she said. I took a revival down in Burnside, Kentucky, with the provision I could hold myself up and only emerge at night to preach. Go right back into my cubbyhole. No phone, no TV, no nothing. And I wrote for 8 solid days. And I wrote my dissertation in a week and turned it in. And few corrections, but not many. And I got that thing done. And I look back on that. How different would my life be had I not finished my PhD? I had no clue that I'd end up being a professor at a seminary and at Southern Seminary. It was just unthinkable. And the truth is, it was through that I got here. You just think, Michael meets Sarah here. Seth meets Candace in Louisville. None of that would have happened had I not finished that PhD. I don't know what I would be. I don't know what the world would be. Here's my point to you is nothing ever just happens. God is always in control. That doesn't mean it feels good. I mean, Naomi has lost a husband and 2 sons. There's nothing you can do that makes that pain disappear, right? Even understanding God's providence and his purpose does not erase the reality of pain and suffering. And we're never told, that's no big deal. God has a plan and a purpose, therefore don't worry about that. You're never told that. What you're told is that even in the pain and the suffering, God's working a plan, and it's going to come out for his glory, and you're good, and you can rest in that. And Ruth is the evidence of that. Providence is the unseen hand of God at work behind all things. And Ruth didn't even know she had a redeemer in Boaz. She didn't even understand what that was or who he was. Ruth only knew one thing: she needed to eat. And hunger is a powerful motivator. And it motivated her to go down there to the field and glean. And the thing is, providence often looks like luck. And people will call it luck. But every time you use the word luck, you rob God of glory. Because I can understand why unbelievers use that word, because things happen and they can't explain. They're not in tune with God's sovereignty, but you and I are. And we should never attribute to luck the gracious hand of our God. God is always at work. Well, you say, what about bad things? You know what? He's God enough to be in control of them too. Satan may have done it. The hand of fallen man may have caused it. But it was not outside of God's control. And if it was, then he's not much of a God. Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Abraham trusted a God who demanded the life of Isaac. And Jesus trusted a God who led him to Calvary's cross. You cannot trust God with resurrection if you don't trust him with death. And we just have to get that deep in our hearts. Job said, can I receive good things at the hand of the Lord and not bad things too? Job didn't understand what was going on, but he did know that theological truth. Providence often uses human appetites. Look at verse 5. Verse 4, behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. Now, again, you see a godliness in him, greeting his reapers. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then, I like this. Okay, we got the niceties out of the way. Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? Now, that tells you something right there. This is the reaction I had that first night at Ashland Avenue when Tanya walked in the junior department, and I saw her and I looked at John York and I said, whose young woman is this? Who is that? And he said, oh, that's Tanya Sharp. You know what? I love Tanya no matter what. Now, I think she's still beautiful, but the truth is, even if she weren't, I'd love her. But I got to confess, the first thing that caught my eye was she was beautiful. And that's what the Lord used with Boaz. Now, whether or not Ruth was beautiful to anybody else, who knows? But she obviously was to him but he notices them. And I think this is what the Lord does. He beautifies us, or he uglifies us. He makes, I look around here and I can tell, looking at some of the men in this room, God did a miracle when he lets your wife find you attractive. He did a miracle. Hallelujah for the miracles, right? And the Lord gives us an appetite, a desire that then he uses to accomplish his will. And that's precisely what he did with Boaz. Whose young woman is this? The appetite for food, for companionship, for achievement, for love. Now, when we live for those appetites, we'll fail. But when we submit them to God's providential care, he uses them for his glory. And notice also, providence often works through human effort. Look at verses 6 and 7. The servant who was in charge of the reaper said, she's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves of the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Okay, now what all does Boaz notice about her right then? Boy, there's several things that have come to his attention. First of all, he noticed, I'm assuming this. Text doesn't say she was pretty, but I'm going, there were probably a lot of people gleaning. He said, whose young woman is this? He found her attractive. And then he says to his reaper, well, who is she? You know, and he said, well, she is a Moabite. She came back with Naomi from the land of Moab. He's heard this, so she doesn't have a husband. This tells you she's available, right? And he describes her work ethic. She's been here since early morning, and she's been gleaning all day. In other words, she's industrious, she works hard, she's taking care of her mother-in-law. Now, Boaz is no idiot. He goes, that ticks a lot of boxes right there. And, you know, when we seek the will of God, it's never wrong to use what I call sanctified common sense. Like what, you know, when you're looking for a wife or a husband, you don't go, oh God, just guide me to the right one. You know, you say, okay, I'm looking for somebody who's godly, someone who works hard, someone who has some good sense, someone who doesn't sit and play video games all day, someone who has a bank account and doesn't go into debt. I mean, that's sanctified common sense. It's just like, I'm not, you know, I mean, who wants to marry a bum? Who wants to marry someone that screams at you all the time? There's just a lot of things that we go, oh, well, this just makes sense. And Boaz, hearing about her work ethic, her care for Naomi, all of this starts making sense to him. Providence often works through human effort. And Ruth is looking for subsistence, but God wants to give her a Savior. And that's what